The Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure will come to order. Apologies from the chair for the second delay. We were delayed to 11 o'clock because it was clear the House was going to remain in session last night. But then I was delayed further last night, way into the late hours, close to midnight, trying to resolve matters with the other body, as we affectionately call our friends across the way. And even into this morning, problems still were being worked out. And so I was unnecessarily delayed by the other body, but necessarily had to delay the beginning of this hearing, the 15th in our series of accountability hearings on performance of state DOTs, metropolitan planning organizations, transit agencies, state revolving loan fund authorities, and the other federal agencies who have direct spending responsibility under the Stimulus Act that Congress passed a year ago. It seems like a much longer time than a year, but in that period of time, as we will hear in the course of today's session, we will be able to account for 1,200,000+ jobs in the programs under the jurisdiction of this committee. An extraordinary record of accomplishment. And on those direct jobs, those that are directly on job site, from highway, transit, and wastewater, not counting all of the others in the federal government agencies, payroll expenditures of $1,800,000,000, federal taxes withheld from those on job sites, $376 million, and unemployment compensation checks avoided, $296 million. That is a net overall extraordinarily positive contribution to our gross domestic product. In addition, the state DOTs can account for 24,000 lane miles of highway improved, built, widened, renewed, and 1,200 bridges, either replaced, restored, reconstructed. That 24,000 lane miles of highway is equal to half of the entire interstate highway system, which took us 50 years to build. And this amount of highway improvement has been done in a year. Before I go further and recognize our witnesses, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Boswell, who has a plane to catch and who had planned to leave town according to our 10 o'clock schedule, but who has delayed his departure, and he has witnesses in this morning's hearing. And Mr. Boswell, thank you for your wonderful support of our stimulus legislation and all the programs of the committee.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, we all thank you for your leadership and your vision on trying to make us teach everybody in this complex that transportation infrastructure is jobs, good paying jobs, and they're not exportable. Their jobs are right here that we need to do, things we need to do anything. And you have certainly been a leader in this. We can't tell you how much appreciate it. And we had the discussions about the recovery going on and the money to be available to our states, and your concept of report back and who's ready to go and so on. And I think I assured you at that time that my Iowa Department of Transportation would be standing ready to go. And I'm very pleased that I can report that's been true. They've been right up near the top in their responsiveness, and we're very privileged to have somebody I've known for a long, long time who's very much an expert in transportation, and that is our director of the Iowa Department of Transportation, Ms. Richardson. And so I welcome her today and thank her, because I know that not only she responded to the direction, she's ready for the next round. She's ready. And then sitting next to her is Mr. Miller, Brad Miller. A young fellow came to our capital city a few years ago, and people said, I don't know if he can fill the shoes of the guy that just went ahead of him, but he has, and he's filled them very well. He's the director of the general manager of Des Moines Area Regional Transportation Authority and the Transit Authority, and he's just doing a bang-up job, innovative, getting people to use the public transportation and making it reliable, dependable, and coming up with a concept to have a location where people can get in and out easily and so on, and I'm sure he'll share that with you today. So I'm just very appreciative that people in my state and my capital city are responding in a very expert way and to the very guidelines that you established. And I look across the table and look about the background. We've got a lot of people here, got a lot of things to share with us. Appreciate it. Just comment about Miss Fisk. It's a truck driver, right? Well, there's a few of us in the Congress who's got an unrestricted CDL, so I just share that with you so I know something about a little bit. So I'm glad to have you here, the one that's got the hands on the wheel and using this road system of ours to keep our commerce going and all things, and appreciate it very much. So, Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and thank you for this, and I can stay a few minutes, but I really appreciate the attention and the leadership that you've given to this extremely important matter to our country and across the whole country, and especially for me in our state of Iowa. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boswell. At this time, the Chair will yield to the distinguished Chair of our Subcommittee on Economic Development and FEMA and a host of other issues, who has been very diligent in holding hearings on her subcommittee's portion of the stimulus. Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I must say, Mr. Chairman, you've taken accountability to a new level. This chairman is sitting in accountability hearings on the stimulus when most members of Congress have long since gone, having passed a historic health care bill they thought they were entitled. Well, Chairman Oberstar was entitled too, but in keeping with the way he always approaches his work, here we sit in an accountability hearing, and one that I think is important, because occasionally you hear people say, well, if you've gotten stimulus funds, I'm not sure I myself have personally felt it. Well, that certainly is true, and Chairman Oberstar and many of us would have preferred to have seen a much larger stimulus package. But what these accountability hearings have done, Mr. Chairman, is to show that the money has hit the ground. And it's hit the ground in no small part because of the new accountability the likes of which the Congress has never seen. These pieces of paper, which every member should carry home with her, tracks not only the subcommittee chairs, because this chairman has held us accountable. I've had 5 tracking hearings myself. But in turn, the agencies are being held accountable, the states are being held accountable, and that is difficult because the agencies are pass-throughs for the states, and yet they are being held accountable. And if you don't believe the states are being held accountable, every member is going to be looking at this sheet to see where her state fit. And I must say, Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to see that the District of Columbia on Highways and Bridges has 85.3% under contract, and in the United States, among the 50 states in the District of Columbia, ranks 14th. I've said to my state, don't embarrass me here. We work too hard to get these funds. I don't see how there could be any controversy about these funds because the chairman has put it in black and white almost every week to help us track our own jurisdictions and the agencies over which we have oversight. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for the accountability that you're showing through these hearings, and if I may say so, Mr. Chairman, through showing up also at the hearings of subcommittees when we are having hearings to hold the agencies under our jurisdiction accountable. My own agencies, EDA, GSA, the Smithsonian, a number of federal agencies, precisely because they know not only am I holding them accountable, but the full chairman is looking at them just as hard, have proceeded in ways that I have found satisfactory. And if you continue as you've done, not only will those who come to these hearings know that this money has been put to good use, as the press focuses on how you are putting facts and figures before the public, it will be impossible to underestimate what the stimulus funding that came through our committee has done for the American people. I thank you again, Mr. Chairman.
Again, I repeat my appreciation and admiration for your persistence in holding the accountability hearings, which have served to spur on the federal agencies to stay on course, stay on track, or be shown to the public for failing to do their job. And the first series of hearings, first 3 months of hearings showed great inconsistencies among the states and federal agencies. But after the information was made public and reports to members and calls into state and federal agencies, they all got on board and they moved their projects out smartly. Mr. Cummings?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for convening today's hearing to enable us to receive an update on the implementation of highway, transit, and wastewater infrastructure products under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. Under your leadership, Mr. Chairman, this committee has kept meticulous records of how Recovery Act funding has been expended. I applaud the diligence of our staff in compiling the data that is available to us today. You've ensured that we have remained focused on the goal of getting this money out of the door and flowing into the economy as quickly as possible, while also ensuring that funding recipients are fully accountable for every single dollar they expend. Today's report shows that more than $48 billion of the more than $64 billion provided for transportation infrastructure projects under the Recovery Act has now been obligated to more than 18,500 projects. Further, of the $38 billion provided for the highway, transit, and wastewater infrastructure projects that are the focus of today's hearing, 88% of the available funding has been put out to bid. Work has begun on more than 12,500 projects, totaling $26.7 billion. These expenditures have created or sustained nearly 350,000 jobs. These are truly stunning achievements, and the work that is underway is producing the new and rehabilitated infrastructure that will ensure our future mobility. Mr. Chairman, many of us forget that when we enacted the stimulus, we faced an economic crisis of unprecedented proportions. We had just had to provide $700 billion in federal funding to keep our entire financial system from melting down. We were uncertain of whether even the extraordinary sum would be adequate. Against that backdrop, Mr. Chairman, while the current unemployment rate of 9.7% is unacceptably high, and I note that unemployment among minorities is still higher, with unemployment among African Americans hovering at some 15.8%, I am certain it would have been far higher had we not taken made the critical decision to enact the Recovery Act. Finally, the fact that we now need reminding of the severity of the crisis we face when we approve these expenditures is perhaps the best possible testament to the effectiveness of the Recovery Act. I again recommend you, Chairman, for holding the hearing today, and I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much for your kind words, but also, again, for the splendid cooperation you, Ms. Norton, all the members of our committee have extended in assuring that the work of the Committee on Stimulus was carried out by the responsible agencies, and each of you doing your respective oversight work, and Mr. Cummings as chair of the Coast Guard and Maritime Subcommittee. At this time, I'd ask, without objection, the statement of Mr. Micah, the senior Republican on our committee, to be included in the record. He had to be out of town and gave his concurrence in proceeding with the hearing without his presence. But his statement will be in the record in full. Today's hearing will focus on the work of the Federal Highway Administration, transit, fixed guideway, wastewater treatment programs. But there's also Amtrak, which has started work on 141 projects totaling $1.1 billion, which is 83% of Amtrak's funding. Those investments will result in the replacement of 80,000 concrete ties, restoration to service of 60 Amfleet passenger cars, 21 superliners, 15 locomotives, and the improvement of 270 passenger stations. FAA has completed work or has work underway on 94% of its $1.2 billion, 663 projects. Those projects went out so fast because of the unique contracting authority of aviation agencies, airport authorities, who can advertise award bids but withhold work on the project until the funding is available. We're able to get further ahead of the work than the surface transportation agencies. So those aviation investments have produced 155 runway improvement projects, 139 airports that accommodate 11 million takeoffs and landings a year, 82 taxiway improvements at 78 airports, additional airports that accommodate 8 million operations. The EPA has awarded $582 million for 57 Superfund construction projects, for design projects, and work is underway or completed on 45 of those that are at a total of $502 million. The Corps of Engineers has committed $3.1 billion for 780 projects, navigation repair or improvement to 284 locks and commercial ports, 1,124 dam and levee safety projects, maintenance and upgrading of 460 Corps of Engineers recreation facilities, lakes and Corps constructed dams that result in recreation areas. Those investments are extremely important to the navigation and movement of people and goods on our inland waterways. And the General Services Administration, prodded by Ms. Norton's hearings, has awarded contracts and begun work on 383 projects, $2.4 billion, 43% of the funding. The Economic Development Administration has awarded 68 grants for $147 million. Coast Guard, alteration of bridges, 4 projects are underway, totaling $81 million. All of these have resulted in jobs, people working, getting their lives restored, such as that of Joyce Fisk, whom I had the unexpected pleasure of meeting last August on Interstate 35 project of Knife River construction. They were doing 28 lane miles of highway between North Branch and Rush City, and it was a day like today, a gloomy, overcast, rainy, drizzly, dreary day, but the clouds parted and the sun came out with Ms. Fisk's smile as she jumped down from her truck on the job site, threw her arms around me and said, "Thank you, I'm working." Joyce Fisk represents the human face of recovery, of stimulus. So we're going to begin with Ms. Fisk's story. Thank you for traveling all the way out here.
Thank you for inviting me. Good morning, everyone, ladies and gentlemen of the committee.
Please get up a little closer to the microphone.
Sorry about that. My name is Joyce Fisk. I am 35 years old. I am the mother of a 12-year-old boy named Austin. I'm married to Jean Fisk, a volunteer firefighter and first responder in our community. We both work for Knife River Corporation in Minnesota. I drive a belly dump, and Jean drives a dump truck. We live in Almalund. It's a small town about 40 miles northeast of Minneapolis and 10 miles east of Interstate 35. I met Chairman Oberstar while working on I-35 project last summer. It was a stimulus-funded project, and I was thrilled that Mr. Oberstar took the time to come see firsthand the job in progress, to take the time to talk to someone like me, just a truck driver, and thankful to have a job. Mr. Oberstar told me about the new bill he was working on and the progress it was making. I went home that evening and wrote a quick email to the Transportation Committee thanking him for taking the time to visit and to see his hard work in action. As a belly dump driver, I transport materials to and from a job. I haul material such as Class 5 rock for the road base, or I haul millings away when we do road tear-outs, and I also haul bituminous mix to a paver. But I not only drive the truck, I am expected to help maintain them. I grease moving parts, I check the oil daily, I crawl in the engine compartment, check for cracks in my frame, and I even make small repairs on the road if I need to. I put 500 miles or more on a day. Driving an 80,000-pound truck isn't easy. I have to constantly be alert for traffic hazards, other drivers, animals, and potholes, and it can be a challenge to drive all day without getting tired. Even more of a challenge is trying to guess what's going to happen next spring. I get laid off every winter, usually around Thanksgiving, and would usually be recalled in May after road restrictions are lifted. Last year was the first time I panicked when I heard our plant only had 10,000 tons of mix and no bids were being won. We're proud of our company. Knife River has a large workforce of knowledgeable men and women who care about their community. We care about each other and provide moral support, but with no jobs to bid because of the recession and uncertain government funding, I watched morale fall. It was difficult to stay optimistic, and we started to argue about who's going to get the hours, and it made work stressful. My husband and I started to wonder, what were we going to do if something didn't come in soon? Are we qualified to get another job to sustain the household? What about health care? We bank up to 600 hours during the summer that allow us to qualify for health care during the layoff season. But if the hours run out, we have to pay for the COBRA. And to continue coverage, it's almost unaffordable in unemployment and to make a mortgage payment too. What could we afford to give up? Austin might have to give up his saxophone. I once had an electric guitar, and my mom made me sell it because we needed the money. We decided to sell the pickup we were making payments on, so now the newest vehicle we own is an 8-year-old Pontiac with 163,000 miles on it. We were preparing for a long summer of no work. The previous year, 2008, was hard on our industry. We saw close friends lose jobs, and we realized we no longer could take ours for granted. But then our plant estimator, he won the bid on the I-35 stimulus project, and we were relieved. The project was the heartbeat of a newfound source of happiness for many of my coworkers and me. We had faith in the economy again. But many of our friends are still out of work, and there are many Minnesota roads in need of repair. Some highways are almost undrivable in a tractor-trailer because they are deteriorated to the point of being unsafe. We need a long-term dedicated highway bill that will allow small companies a chance to rebuild and provide real jobs that will last. Short-term bills are good for keeping a few companies afloat, but the real deal of a 6-year, $450 billion dedication of funds to transportation can restore confidence to companies and their workers. A new funding bill can ease the congestion in big cities and heavily traveled highways. Funding for light rail transit can save time, money, and help clean up our environment. Without future funding, I don't see manufacturers selling new equipment. There will be no companies starting up and offering new jobs. Road construction is constant. There will always be a need for repairs. Let's stop the Band-Aid approach and put money into infrastructure that's going to offer real jobs that are going to last and get our economy moving again. Thank you for this opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much for that heartfelt statement. You just summed it all up so well. Your personal story, though, has been repeated 1,200,000 times all over the country. People who were laid off, who faced a bleak future, and who have had a respite. And now our task, our challenge is, as you suggested, as you appealed for, to enact the 6-year authorization bill and continue and extend the regular programs of the Federal Aid Highway program and make it possible to do the more complex projects that take longer time and involve more effort and more subcontractors, where minority enterprises will have more of an opportunity than in simple mill and overlay projects. But before I go to our next witness, I must observe that on the job site, I've driven over I-35 at that point many, many times, maybe hundreds of times over the years. But there was a rut so deep that my forearm disappeared in it. The engineer put his road level on the surface and went right over it. This about 2 inches over my forearm. It's not a dainty little forearm either. That was the nature of the project being undertaken, and it was so heartwarming. I'd been at that sand and gravel pit that Knife River opened to carry out the project, and there were workers doing the classifying of sand, gravel, and aggregate who had been laid off 2 months earlier, who now were back on the job as Ms. Fisk. And staff reminded me, I misstated the number of road miles. I've been using a 6-week-old figure. We're now at 34,438 miles of highway improvements. We'll come back to each of the witnesses in due course. Our next witness is Mr. Florentino Esparza Luna, carpenter. My grandfather, Alessandro Giuseppe Grillo, came from Naples, Italy as a carpenter in 1896. Settled in Providence, Rhode Island to build homes. And then when iron ore was discovered in northern Minnesota, district that I now represent, he and many others were lured west to build homes in the iron ore mining country. So we come from a family of carpenters. It's very touching for me. And one of my treasured pictures is a picture of Alessandro Giuseppe Grillo and me, 5 years old, hammer in hand, pounding nails in the home that I still live in. Mr. Luna.
Thank you, Chairman. Overstar Ranking Member Mika, and members of the Transportation and Infrastructure community. It's an honor to join you today. My name is Florentino Esparza Luna, and I'm a resident of District Heights, Maryland, and I'm a proud member of the United Brotherhood of Carpenters and Joiners, Local 1145, a local union with the Mid-Atlantic Region Council Carpenters, MARC. MARC covers the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia, and West Virginia. Local 1145 is based on Upper Marlboro, Maryland, but we work through the region. My message today is simple and straightforward. The stimulus passed by this Congress and signed by the President Obama provided me with the job that I have now. I'm a living proof of the job creation from the Recovery Act. The stimulus helped fund the Fairfax County Parkway project near Fort Belvoir, where I work. I appreciate being able to work for a private contractor with the federal dollars you provided in the transportation. A job means so much. Nothing is more important than providing for my family. I work for Cherry Hill Construction on the Fairfax County Parkway project in nearby Virginia. After being unemployed for over 4 months, I started work on this project on December 2009. I am a skilled carpenter. I build concrete forms and perform other carpenter work on this huge multi-million-dollar project. There are 30 carpenters working on the project now. The project is expected to employ about 350 workers in the construction trade. It will take well over a year to complete. We will build the extension to the Fairfax County Parkway. My contractor will perform the first 2 phases of the work. The project involves extending the parkway, grading, draining, building a sound wall, and more. The project should make a big difference in Northern Virginia, where, as you know, traffic can be terrible. I sincerely appreciate the support of the members of the Congress who voted for the Recovery Act. You played a key role in helping me provide for my family. I have a wife and 2 children. It's not easy getting by an unemployment check. I didn't much right there, big working. Building my community's transportation system, I know that's true for the construction craft workers through the industry. Construction workers are struggling. Many of the work opportunities in these residential and commercial parts of the industry dry up with the recession. About 20% of the members of my local union are unemployed. Even with an employment rate twice the national average, my local union is doing better than the rest of the construction industry. As you know, Chairman Ostar, the unemployment rate nationally in construction is over 27%. Too many construction workers simply cannot find work and provide for their families. I would be a lot worse if it wasn't for stimulus. The Recovery Act allowing me to put food on my family's table, allowing me to provide health care for myself and my family. And I also able to put money into retirement so that I can retire in dignity. The Carpenters Union and my employer also invest in the future workforce, making investment in apprenticeship and training. The Carpenters Union believes not just in jobs, but in long-term career. Unfortunately, the high unemployment rate in construction and in my union has made it difficult to find work opportunities. That's why the support from this Congress and this President in providing real jobs through the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act has been so important to me and my brothers and sisters at Local 1145. All construction workers hope that Congress will make more of this investment in our economy. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I sincerely appreciate it.
Thank you very much for that wonderful, heartwarming testament. We're starting off with 2 home run hitters here of a very personal testimony, a personal experience. That's, to me, that is reward enough for the hours put in, the hundreds of hours we put in on crafting this bill, beginning in December of 2007, moving it through the House in September of 2008, but resistance from the previous administration said they'd veto the bill. Then we had an election. President Obama said he'd sign a stimulus bill, and or President-elect Obama at the time, and as president, he did sign it. And as for the future of transportation, this is it. This is the bill that we've reported from subcommittee for the 6-year authorization, 750 pages, probably a few more to be added once we finish the final legislative drafting. There'll be a total transformation of the Department, of the Federal Highway Administration, of the Federal Transit Administration, and we'll be able to move projects much more expeditiously. We found lessons learned in the stimulus that states can move projects out much faster than in the traditional scheme of things, and we are incorporating those lessons learned into this bill. So we're moving ahead, and your encouragement is very important for me and for my colleagues on this committee. And I know Mr. Micah has many times said we just have to move ahead with this bill. All of the members feel that way. We've had little difficulty getting the Senate to concur with us, but Senator Boxer made a statement at a hearing 2 weeks ago and again last week that she will move ahead with the bill and start with our document as the foundation for it. So I am very encouraged that we will be able to complete the bill in this session of Congress. Ms. Richardson, Director of the Iowa Department of Transportation, you've already been warmly and generously introduced by Mr. Boswell.
I'm Nancy Richardson, Director of the Iowa Department of Transportation, and on behalf of the American Association of Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO, I'm here to talk to you about three things. First, the successes states are achieving through the Recovery Act. Second, the state's ability to spend further funding on additional ready-to-go projects. And third, the role of transportation in rebuilding and sustaining our nation's economy and the importance of passage of a new federal highway and transit authorization bill. But first, Mr. Chairman, let me thank you and your members of the committee for your commitment to transportation, which led to the enactment of the HIRE Act that extends the highway and transit programs through the end of the year. This means that Congress can now turn its attention to your priority and ours, the enactment of a comprehensive multi-year bill. Speaking of economic recovery, as you know, the Recovery Act had a March 2nd use it or lose it deadline. And I'm happy to report today that every state obligated every highway dollar they were eligible to receive, and not one dime was returned to Washington for redistribution. We are proud of the thousands of jobs the Economic Recovery Act enabled us to support in Iowa and across the nation, and of the long-lasting economic benefits of this capital investment. The state's record of 100% obligation of these funds by the deadline did not happen just by accident. It took early planning and preparation and quick action. I am particularly proud of the pace of getting the Recovery Act funds put to work in my state of Iowa. I am pleased that Iowa has consistently ranked in the top 5 states in your committee's rankings of how states have moved to get the Recovery Act funded projects out to bid, under contract, and underway. My state is just one of 50 examples of how the states have put the Recovery Act money to swift and good use. Prior to the Act even becoming law, the Iowa DOT worked with local partners to identify potential projects which would qualify for funding. We wanted to be ready to hit the ground running when the bill was passed, and we were. Through these partnerships, we were able to quickly identify over 645 miles of highways and streets, 55 miles of trails, 36 bridges and structures, and 4 freight rail projects that were in need of improvement or replacement and were ready to make use of Iowa's $358 million. Work has begun in Iowa on over 200 projects, and as of March 15th, $215 million, or over 60%, of the highway funding available to Iowa has been received from the FHWA as reimbursement for payments to contractors and vendors. This funding was injected directly into our economy last year and was responsible for creating or retaining jobs all across the state. When spring arrives and the construction season begins again in Iowa, we will see the remaining $143 million in Recovery Act funds being used to once again support jobs, aid economic recovery, and continue to improve Iowa's transportation system. The same success has occurred as a result of the transit capital funding. With the $25 million in transit fund for Iowa's small urban and rural transit systems, we were able to identify, for much-needed replacement, 216 old transit vehicles. As of the end of February, 136 of those transit vehicles ordered had already been delivered and put into service in Iowa. Congress and the public also expect transparency and accountability in our administration of federal funds, and I am confident that the DOTs and our local partners will meet and exceed those expectations. But what does this mean to Americans? First of all, it has meant jobs. I understand that every member of the committee has been given a copy of AASHTO's report, Projects and Paychecks. It found that states have created or saved 280,000 direct on-project jobs. Total employment related to the projects has reached 890,000. While transportation received 6% of total Recovery Act dollars, as of this past December, it was responsible for at least 14% of the total direct jobs saved or created to date. But the real story is about people, the people whose jobs were saved or who went back to work, the people who were able to make their mortgage payments, put their kids through school, and pay for health care, as you've just heard. These investments in our nation's transportation network, first and foremost, have put and are putting paychecks in people's pockets. And although the primary focus of the Recovery Act was job creation and short-term immediate economic stimulus, we should not overlook the fact that these investments will provide long-lasting benefits with improvements to the nation's transportation network. We're very appreciative of Congress's recognition of the role that transportation could play in this nation's economy, and we want you to know, Chairman, that we remain poised to support continued economic recovery and job growth. Early this year, AASHTO went back to the states to determine additional ready-to-go projects. The states have identified more than 9,800 projects valued at close to $80 billion that could move through the federal approval process within 120 days of enactment. The Recovery Act is working, and the states could do more of the same if additional funds were available. Finally, we urge you to enact a multi-year highway and transit bill before this Congress adjourns. We believe the $500 billion surface transportation funding target that you, Chairman Oberstar, have established is a reasonable goal for this 6-year authorization period, and Congress should seek to fund it. We need a balanced bill that increases funding for both highways and transit and funds continued progress on high-speed rail. We also need a balanced bill that meets the needs of both rural and urban parts of the country. Mr. Chairman, we stand ready to work diligently with you to see that reauthorization happens promptly. In closing, let me say thank you to Congress for providing us Recovery Act funds for transportation improvements. The state's DOTs have taken seriously your confidence in us that we could swiftly and wisely spend the money in order to benefit the economy, and we have delivered. We stand ready to swiftly and wisely spend additional funding that you might provide for continued economic recovery. And finally, we urge you to continue your efforts and advocacy for passage of a well-funded, balanced, multi-year highway and transit authorization bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to testify and will be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much for that splendid testimony. Congratulations on the superb achievements in Iowa under the stimulus, as you've reported, and for the work of AASHTO. This is the report, Projects and Paychecks, and it's well documented with photos of successful projects all around the country. It's I just love stuff like that. You know, it just gets me going. And this is the AASHTO proposal for 9,800 additional projects, and nearly half of those are projects that Mr. Horsley, your executive director, has said can be under contract within 90 days, and the rest within 120 days. And that would satisfy the requirements of the bill we passed in December in the House, which unfortunately the Senate has yet to complete action on. They've only dealt with half of it. And for readiness, there are many touching stories, but one that really sticks in my mind was that of Secretary Gary Ridley of Oklahoma, who, in my visit out there to Tulsa and Oklahoma City, pointed to the interdispersal loop project, or the loop around Tulsa, and he said, we began designing this in November after your hearing, the one I held in October. He said, that committee is serious. We better be ready. I told my engineers, I want you to take we're going to do an 18 months of design in 4 months, and I want you to take your design and engineering plans to church with you on Sunday, because if I need you, I'll call. And they did, and he did, and they had it designed, and they're they're about more than halfway through the $76 million project, which includes 44 bridges, by the way. So you've got a great story, and all of your colleagues across the country and all the state DOTs have great stories as well. Now we'll move to transit with Brad Miller, General Manager of the Des Moines Area Regional Transit Authority, speaking for APTA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Oberstar, I'm honored to submit testimony regarding the Des Moines Area Regional Transit Authority's use of funding for the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which has already created jobs in central Iowa and around the country while improving public transit. DART serves Iowa's capital region with a service area population of just over 400,000. While DART and Des Moines may be somewhat smaller than some of the other transit systems your committee has heard updates from, I'm pleased to report the funds have had a profound positive impact for our 16,000 daily riders. DART received $7.8 million in funding. Not only has DART been awarded all of our ARA funding and will sign contracts for 100% of the funds by June, but DART has already drawn down and cut checks for nearly half the funds, getting these dollars into the economy and generating dozens of good jobs and improving the transportation services in Des Moines. I don't think our story is unusual, as FTA has awarded more than 99% of the $8.4 billion that was made available for transit under ARA. DART spent more than a third of its ARA funds on bus replacements, and I was thrilled to see the funded buses roll onto our property, as shown in the picture, just 2 weeks ago. The committee has no doubt heard significant testimony of the strong need for funding of our country's infrastructure to achieve a state of good repair. This policy is as true for small and mid-sized transit systems as it is for our nation's aging rail systems and deteriorating bridges and highways. Not only did the ARA funds benefit DART in Des Moines, but I am also pleased to report that ARA funds supported the replacement of more than 180 smaller buses and 17 large buses at other transit systems throughout Iowa. Iowa takes great pride in its expansive network of rural transit services in all 99 counties of the state. The senior citizens and job seekers living in Iowa's smaller towns who rely on public transit are also seeing the benefits of ARA. DART used $1 million of ARA funds to help build an energy-efficient expansion for our bus storage facility. The project is well underway, and the contractor has identified over 30 full-time jobs and more than $200,000 in construction, wage, and benefits that have already been created by this ARA-funded project. The recovery funds have moved DART's #1 capital project priority a step closer to construction by supporting the design of the LEED certified transit hub in downtown Des Moines. Now the design has advanced for this important facility that will create not only 200-plus direct construction jobs, but it will also be a catalyst for additional job growth as DART will be able to vacate its outdated transit mall along Walnut Street and provide space for first-floor retail and small businesses. Finally, DART is one of the many transit systems to gratefully use 10% of our allocated ARA funds for a one-time source of operating assistance. While not every system has chosen to use this flexibility, preliminary results from an APTA survey now underway show that about a third of the approximate 150 agencies responding to the survey so far are using a portion of ARA funding to prevent layoffs, avoid fare increases, or maintain service. With the help of nearly $800,000 in ARA funds for operations in Des Moines, along with pay reductions and furlough days for me and my non-union staff, we were able to reduce our budget gap and save more than 30 bus operator jobs. As the general manager of a 150-bus system like Des Moines, it's yours truly that makes the presentations at public meetings and listens to the hundreds of riders who tell me they're going to lose their jobs if we cut their bus service. We just completed 10 such meetings 3 weeks ago, and I'll recall a story of one woman I met at a public meeting at the Forest Avenue Library in Des Moines. Miss R. Cofield was at the meeting with her 3-year-old daughter to fight to keep the weekend bus service past the House of Mercy Residential Treatment Facility, where she and more than 40 other single mothers live with their children. She said she and the other mothers at the House of Mercy were going to lose their jobs at the Quest Telecommunication Call Center in downtown Des Moines if we cut the weekend bus service on DART's Route number 5. She asked the question I heard more than a dozen times at the hearings. Why are you buying buses and building a transit hub when you could be saving routes? I tried my best to explain the limits on using funds for operations versus capital expenses, but as the committee knows, when transit is your lifetime to keeping your job to supporting your struggling family, you're not going to be easily convinced. Luckily, thanks to the allowance of the 10% of ARA funds for operating assistance, DART was able to preserve that weekend service that Ms. Cofield and many others rely on. Certainly, the question of operating assistance is a challenging one for the committee. Undoubtedly, many transit agencies, particularly smaller agencies, would accept a change to allow them to spend more federal money on operations. However, they would defer capital projects, including desperately needed bus replacements. But these are certainly extraordinary times. DART's 5% cut in service and likely layoff of 20 bus operators are the most substantial cuts we've had to make since the 1980s. We're extremely thankful to the committee for the temporary ability to use 10% of the ARA funds for operations and would strongly support continuing this authorization on a temporary basis. I finished my remarks by noting that without a new federal investment in a long-term reauthorization bill, it will be difficult to maintain the employment benefits that ARA has already created for our agency. Needless to say, we definitely support the committee's efforts to approve a multi-year transportation bill at the highest level of investment possible for public transit. Such a bill would stabilize DART's finances, advance our job-creating capital projects, and strongly assist our efforts to improve transit in Iowa. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller, for that splendid testimony, the before and after pictures, for the story about, for your remarks on operating assistance. It was very important for us to include that language in this bill. We extend it in the authorization bill and double the funding for transit over the 6 years of this bill. I'll now invite Mr. Jeff Freeman, who is the Deputy Director of the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority, who has an extraordinary story to tell us of how they've leveraged their funds to achieve a nearly 50% increase over or more of the Recovery Act funds allocated to Minnesota and provide clean water for communities that in many cases didn't have it at all. I will excuse myself for a few minutes for a meeting with the Speaker and invite Mr. Cummings to chair the hearing.
Mr. Freeman, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name again is Jeff Freeman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority. Thank you for the opportunity to come before the committee to talk about our Clean Water State Revolving Fund program and our experience with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funds. The Minnesota Public Facilities Authority is a multi-agency infrastructure financing authority that manages the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, a state infrastructure bank for transportation projects, and several other infrastructure financing programs. Since the Clean Water State Revolving Fund began in 1989, Minnesota has received $577 million in federal capitalization grants, added $150 million in state matching funds, and leveraged those funds with our own AAA-rated revenue bonds to finance $2.4 billion in clean water projects throughout the state. These low-interest loans have saved cities and their taxpayers over $530 million in interest charges. This financing has helped local governments rehab and replace aging wastewater treatment plants, upgrade systems to meet new standards, rehab collection systems, construct new interceptors, and a variety of other projects. These are essential infrastructure projects that protect and improve water quality and also, of course, have a major economic impact, not only in terms of the construction jobs that they create, but also in terms of providing a critical foundation for the economic vitality of the cities that have and need this infrastructure. The enactment of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in February 2009 provided badly needed capital for these programs, but also created significant challenges for the state revolving fund programs. The specific provisions and accountability requirements attached to ARA required EPA and each state to develop and implement new processes and procedures within a very short period of time. In Minnesota, there's a flurry of activity from between February and April of 2009 as we put together all the pieces leading up to our formal application for the funds in mid-April. On June 8th, 2009, we received the official notice that the funds have been awarded, and by June 25th, 3 weeks later, virtually all of the funds had been committed for projects that were approved, bid, and under construction. Formal loan agreements were then executed over the next few months. Minnesota's share of the ARA funds for clean water was approximately $82.5 billion. We awarded $44.7 million as principal forgiveness and $17.5 million for green infrastructure projects for energy and water efficiency improvements. Our strategy for the ERA funds focused on using the principal forgiveness aspect in 3 ways, with an emphasis on creating incentives to get projects moving quickly. We offered 20% principal forgiveness to all projects on a first-come, first-served basis as they were open bids and were ready to start construction. We also directed principal forgiveness to deal with particular affordability problems and as an incentive for the green infrastructure aspects of the projects. To get the biggest impact and fund the most projects, we leveraged those $82.5 million in ERA funds with over $100 million in non-ERA clean water SRF loans to finance 25 projects for a total investment of $182 million. To date, we have expended over 62% of the ERA clean water funds, and our job reports show that there's been 295,000 job hours created with a total payroll of $11.7 million. The Clean Water ERA funds went to a variety of cities and projects. I'd like to give you a couple examples. The city of Waseca financed a $16 million improvements to their wastewater treatment and collection system. The undersized system was creating raw sewage discharges to Clear Lake and impaired water, and also sewage backups in people's basements. To prepare for the project, the city had increased their rates by 60% to an average household cost of $55 a month, but they still would have been unable to move ahead with the project without the ERA funds. City of Duluth received $5 million to build a sewage overflow tank on the shores of Lake Superior to prevent overflows into the lake during storm events. The City of Grand Rapids constructed a $30 million project to relocate their primary treatment and solids facilities and incorporated energy and water conservation improvements into that project as a result of the ERA funds. Our experience with ERA illustrates some of the features of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that have made it so successful in general. The Clean Water Fund utilizes a project priority list, a comprehensive list that in Minnesota's case, we have 381 projects for about $2.1 billion. Each year we get over $400 million of requests for projects to move ahead to construction. We know that not all of those can go ahead because there will be delays for various reasons, so we purposely put more projects on the list than we expect to go ahead, and we use our ability to sell AAA-rated revenue bonds as the flexibility of that to provide funding for the projects that are able to go ahead. When our board approved our intended use plan in the summer of 2008, at that time the economy was already slowing down, and they recognized the importance of putting more projects on the list to give as many as an opportunity to move ahead. Because of that, we put 5 times as many projects on the list as we typically fund, and because of that, we were well positioned to fund the ERA projects when the money came through. Mr. Chairman and members, thank you for your strong support of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. We look forward to working with you on reauthorization of the program in the future, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Freeman. We'll now hear from Mr. Stephen Wright, D. Wright, Vice President, Wright Brothers Construction Company, Inc., representing the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. Welcome.
Mr. Cummins, I'm Steve Wright, President of Wright Brothers Construction Company in Charleston, Tennessee. I'm here today representing the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, where I serve as the Southern Region Vice Chairman. Wright Brothers was founded in 1961 by my father and my uncle. Our company performs a variety of highway and heavy construction services. We currently have projects underway in Tennessee, Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina. Mr. Chairman, the Recovery and Reinvestment Act's transportation investments have been a resounding success. Its impacts, however, cannot be truly appreciated without understanding of what our sector faced prior to the measure's enhancement. The U.S. transportation construction market had been in steady decline since 2007 due to state budgets, the general economy, and increasing material prices. The continued recession made this bad situation worse. Highway contractors laid off almost 26,000 employees in 2008 and early 2009. In fact, my company's employment peaked in 2008 at 350 workers and has since fallen by 34%, due largely to declines in the private construction market. Going into 2009, we face severe recession, uncertainty about the federal surface transportation program reauthorization, and continued state budget difficulties. Not surprisingly, this made for a very sobering outlook. The one bright spot for our sector was the Recovery Act's transportation investments. My written testimony includes substantial information that describes the exemplary pace at which these funds have been put to use and their real-world impacts. I would like to highlight one point to demonstrate the contribution of the Recovery Act's transportation investments. Figure 2 on page 4 of my testimony compares the transportation contracts awards for 10 months prior to the enactment of the Recovery Act with the awards 10 months after these investments hit the marketplace. This information is significant because contract awards are a leading indicator of future construction activity. Following the Recovery Act, highway construction awards increased 19.4%. Bridge contracts are up 14.6%. Airport awards have grown 61.2%. Transit contracts ballooned 216%. Because there are a variety of U.S. transportation construction investment sources, it is difficult to attribute the increase of contract awards solely to the Recovery Act. However, it's abundantly clear that the 2-year negative transportation construction market trend began reversing itself in May of last year. This is the same point at which we saw Recovery Act funds begin supporting projects. As Figure 3 demonstrates, this positive trend is continuing with highway contract awards growing this January, while awards in January of 2008 and 2009 had declined. To put a real face on this data, Wright Brothers won 4 separate Recovery Act contracts. 3 of these are small projects in Tennessee that have allowed us to save the jobs of one 5-person concrete crew. We also have a large capacity and reconstruction project in Alabama that has allowed us to hire 19 people and saved at least that many jobs. We're expected to add more people as we get further into this project. Half of the project is subcontracted, so we represent only a portion of its job impacts. The leadership at the Alabama Department of Transportation has said that while this project was a priority for them, they would not have had the ability to move it forward without the Recovery Act. The success of the Recovery Act notwithstanding, the transportation construction industry continues to struggle with unemployment at record levels and great certainty about future state and federal transportation investments. I can state with all certainty that as bad as things are right now, they would have been much worse without the Recovery Act. To sustain and build on the Recovery Act and re-energize the long-term growth potential of the United States, we must not lose sight of the need to enact a 6-year surface transportation authorization bill at the investment levels proposed by this committee as soon as possible. Thank you for your leadership on the Recovery Act, the recent transportation extension, your ongoing efforts to deliver a multi-year reauthorization bill. I appreciate this opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wright. We'll now hear from Mr. Jeff Wharton, President Impulse NCLC. I guess is in North Carolina, huh?
Yes, sir.
Very well. Thank you very much for being with us.
Okay, well, good afternoon, Mr. Cummings. My name is Jeffrey Wharton, President of Impulse NC. Thank you for this opportunity to present testimony regarding the job creation and retention impacts of the public transit investments included in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. As a brief background, Impulse is an overhead contact hardware manufacturer located in Mount Olive, North Carolina, with 30 direct employees, plus a large nationwide sub-supplier base. Our product, which dates back to 1888 through the Ohio Brass Company, is used to support aerial wires that feed power for light rail trains, streetcars, vintage trolleys, and electric trolley buses. Impulse is a Marmon Group Berkshire Hathaway company and a member of the American Public Transportation Association. My testimony today is on behalf of my company. I am pleased to report that in 2009, my new project business grew 35%. And in 2010, I expect sales to grow another 10 to 15%. I do not believe that my business would have survived without the investment in public transportation by way of the ARA stimulus funding. Our projects include the Los Angeles Gold Line extension, the Denver West Corridor Line, the Pittsburgh North Shore Connector, and the Portland Streetcar Loop project, among others. I recognize that most of these projects were already in the funding pipeline as new capital projects. And as the program and project authorizations under Safety Lieu approached expiration, ARA funding served as an important bridge between that bill and the next authorization bill and helped expedite these projects. In talking with my supply partners, I have come to learn how much they have relied on my business due to the tough economy. Shirley Gaines, president of Sign High Castings, a woman-owned business located in Greenwood, South Carolina, told me that Impulse has kept her business afloat with the decline in the automotive industry. She was able to keep 36 jobs through the orders received by Impulse and the ARA-funded projects. John Petro, a third-generation owner for Warsaw Foundry in Warsaw, Indiana, has been able to maintain 44 jobs through the transit orders directly from Impulse. John stated that the only sales growth in his business that he's experienced has been from the Impulse transit orders. Mac Flynn, plant manager for the Brost Foundry that operates in Mansfield, Ohio, and Cleveland, attributes over 29% of his business to Impulse, helping keep 50 to 60 employees working. And lastly, Korn's Galvanizing Company, located in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, has been able to keep 44 jobs through Impulse orders and the quick implementation of economic stimulus and jobs funding for public transit. Previously, they had relied mostly on commercial work, and today Impulse is one of the larger accounts. I could go on and on with suppliers in Texas, California, Illinois, Washington State, and others. As you can see, Impulse's transit sales have impacted businesses throughout the U.S., and the associated ARA funding has directly contributed to saving hundreds of jobs. Let's face it, transportation is the backbone of the economy, and public transit is an incredibly important aspect of our national surface transportation system. Public transit creates great jobs. I want to make substantial long-term investments to grow my business, develop new products and technologies that will improve public transit options. But I need a long-term vision from our elected officials. I truly wish to thank Chairman Oberstar and this committee for your steadfast leadership in advancing transportation investment through ARA and your efforts to pass a new surface transportation authorization bill. Let there be no mistake, there is a cliff fast approaching if we do not continue to invest and recognize the immediate and invaluable benefit that public transit provides our economy, quality of life, and the environment. I thank the committee, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Ms. Veronique, am I close?
Yes, very, very.
We thought Mr. Oberstar would be in the chair. You know, he speaks French.
I was told.
The rugby? The rugby?
Yeah, sure.
Is that close?
Yeah, close.
Very well. Who is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Thank you.
Mr. Cummings, it's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the allocation of the Recovery Act funds. My name is Veronique de Rugy. I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, a research-based organization where I study budget and tax issues. It's in that capacity that I've been tracking stimulus dollars since last February. Using recipient report data from recovery.gov and economic and political data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, GovTrack.us, and others, I've compiled a series of facts about stimulus spending. My interest is simply to make use of the tens of thousands of stimulus recipient reports recently published on recovery.gov and to put the aggregate information contained in those reports in a larger context. This report is the second of a series of reports published on a quarterly basis as new recipient reports are released each quarter. The data presented here covers the fourth quarter of the calendar year 2009 reports of Recovery Act contract and grants only. The complete data set used for this report is available for download at mercatus.org. You can find the details about my methodology in my written testimony, but today I will highlight some of the main results of my analysis. First, in the second quarter for which recovery.gov reports are available, over 65,000 contracts and grants were awarded. The total spending reached $170 billion. That is roughly $1 billion awarded per week, and an additional $13.6 billion reported received over the previous quarter. This is a sharp decline in spending compared to the $156 billion received in the previous 3 months. At that rate, the government should be done awarding stimulus dollars by 2020. Second, the total number of jobs claimed to have been created or saved overall by the stimulus actually declined from last quarter, shrinking from about 634,000 to a little over 597,000 jobs. This job shrinkage could have resulted from change made by the White House on how to count jobs. However, it goes to show how terribly difficult it is to account for net jobs created from stimulus spending. It also outlines the nearly impossibility to account for how many jobs were saved by the stimulus fund. Third, I found for every $286,000 spent, one job was claimed to have been created. Fourth, the main argument for enacting the $787 billion stimulus bill was that if the government spent money where it is the most needed, it would create jobs and trigger economic growth. Hence, we would expect the government to invest relatively more money in districts that have the highest unemployment rates and less money in districts with lower unemployment rates. Controlling for the percentage of the district employed in construction industry, which is often used as a proxy for the vulnerability to recession of a district. We find no statistical correlation between all relevant unemployment indicators and the allocation of funds. This suggests that unemployment so far has not been the factor leading the awards. Also, I found no correlation between other economic indicators such as income, however you want to measure it, and stimulus fund. Finally, on average, Democratic districts received 1.5 as many awards as Republican ones. Democratic districts also received 2.5 times more stimulus dollars than Republican districts. Republican districts also received smaller awards on average. There are more Democratic districts than Republican districts in the Congress. This is why, then, I checked for the correlation between political indicator and stimulus fund. I found that with the exception of the district's party's affiliation, which is whether the district's representation was Republican or Democrat, there is no effect of political variable on allocation of stimulus funds. So how much does party affiliation matter? While the effect is significant, because of the specification of the model, more confidence should be placed on the relationship between the two variables than on the quantification of that relationship. In plain English, it means that while I am confident that whether the district is represented by a Republican or a Democrat matters for funding, we are not sure what the weight of this particular factor was compared to others that went into the decision of spending the money, such as the formula, for instance. Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify before you today. I'm looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeRugby.
De Rugy, that's
Okay.
fine.
Let me just ask you something. I just asked staff, what you were basing those figures on. And I'm just curious, You know, a third of this money went to tax cuts, right?
The report that I published is based on the data that is available on recovery.gov. This is the data reported by recipients of the stimulus dollars for contract and grants.
Okay.
Exclusively.
Oh, I see.
So
when we talk about stimulus, almost 2/3 of the money went to two things: one, to tax cuts, and two, to helping states address their issues and keep policemen hired and fire folks hired and that kind of thing. So I guess what you've got left, you're talking about the contracts themselves. I see.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ms. Richardson, you indicated in your testimony that states have $80 billion of ready-to-go projects if additional funding were made available. What do you mean by ready to go, and how long would it take for those projects to actually begin construction, and would the majority be repavement projects?
By ready to go, when we did the survey, we defined that similar to what the Recovery Act had been, and said within 120 that they could be obligated, using that federal definition of obligation, they could be obligated within 120 days of enactment. We've done some additional analysis of that, and about half of those could actually be put to contract within the first 90 days following enactment, which would be even a more aggressive time frame. The types of projects, the $80 billion is across all modes, so it's not just highway. It's also aviation and trails and transit and the other kinds of projects. But in the highway side, certainly a fair amount of it, or a certain amount of it, would be in resurfacing and preservation of the existing system. But there were also projects, a mix of projects that would be expansion or creation of some new lane miles.
Now, you discussed a number of direct on-project jobs among the states made possible by the Recovery Act expenditures. Has AASHTO tracked the total DBE participation across the states?
I don't know if AASHTO has, but I do believe that that is being tracked as part of the reporting that we are doing either to the Federal Highway Administration or to GAO or someone like that. So that is being tracked. We always track that, frankly, on all of our projects. We track the percentage that we've achieved, and that data is out there for that related to the Recovery Act. I don't have that number in my head, but it's available.
All right, thank you. Mr. Freeman, have other states provided principal forgiveness as you've done, to your knowledge? Keep your voice up.
Sorry, Mr. Cummings, yes. All states have used the principal forgiveness. The ERA funds that went to Clean Water State Revolving Funds required a minimum of 50% be provided as principal forgiveness. Each state has done that a little differently. In our state, we have affordability criteria, and we've used some state funds in the past to deal with affordability problems. That's where we directed most of our principal forgiveness funds. I think that's similar experience with other states, but each state has, and that's kind of the strength of the Clean Water State Revolving Fund, is each state has some flexibility to design the criteria and the procedures to best fit their needs.
And do you know what has been the experience of the other states with that process? Do you have any idea?
I don't have the numbers from other states. I know that all states did meet the 1 year, the requirement to have the funds under contract and under construction within the 1 year period of time, and as part of that have met all of the principal forgiveness requirements as well.
Now, is this something that you've done in the past?
We've, with some state program, provided some additional subsidy for communities that have affordability problems. We've found that for smaller communities in particular, the costs for wastewater treatment infrastructure can easily go over $50, $60, $70 a month per household. And at that rate, communities just can't afford to move ahead with projects without some additional subsidies. So we've done that with some state funds. The principal forgiveness through the ERA funding gives us another tool and a significant share of those funds to be able to meet those needs.
Now, Mr. Miller, you indicated in your testimony that you use 10% of your allocated Recovery Act funds for one-time operating assistance infusion. Is that right? Is that what you said?
That's right. That's right.
What will happen to your operating budget when this infusion is no longer available?
Well, Mr. Cummings, that's a very good question. You know, we are hopeful that the economy will start to improve and some of our other sources of revenue will improve, but we certainly would be supportive of additional authorization to use some of our other federal funds or additional stimulus dollars should they be allocated in the same way.
And you also indicated that you purchased new buses with the Recovery Act funds. Is that right?
That's right.
And I know that purchases have been common with recovery funds. You said that you have taken delivery of your new buses, but have other transit agencies experienced delays in getting buses given the large number of orders that they've placed? Do you know?
I mean, I have heard that we're very lucky in that we've already received delivery just 2 weeks ago of our buses, and some other transit systems have not received theirs. But you know, even under normal times, it takes a year to a year and a half to deliver buses. So I have not heard of any particularly long delays in receiving buses, and they are already out on the street driving around Des Moines, Iowa right now. So.
Finally, let me just ask you, Mr. Wright, I just have two questions, and the chairman will take over. Mr. Wright, what are the trends in state transportation budgets in 2010, and are the states able to afford to maintain their existing systems, or is even maintenance suffering in this economic environment?
Mr. Cummings, the state I'm most familiar with is Tennessee, and their program has evolved into basically a maintenance-only program. Mm-hmm. They have almost no funding available for new capacity.
So they're basically just maintaining.
That's right.
And are there any specific changes to the metropolitan planning process that you are advocating for the, say, next reauthorization?
I would encourage anything you can do to simplify the process. It takes too long to get a project from creation to contract where we actually begin to work on it.
Well, I can tell you, and I know he'll tell you about this, but our chairman has been trying to figure out how to do that, how we can go about doing what you just said. It's not been easy, but we're trying to figure it out. And I think with the reauthorization that he's proposing, I think you'll be pleased with some of the things in there because it goes a long way towards what you're talking about, Chairman.
To extend the conversation you just had with Mr. Cummings, Chairman of our Subcommittee on Coast Guard, we establish in this bill that has been reported from Subcommittee a program of an Office of Project Expediting in the Federal Highway and the Federal Transit Administration. It's intolerable that it takes 3 years to do, under current law, a simple mill and overlay. Go in and grind the surface of a roadway, reprocess it and put it back in place. Or 14 years from idea to ridership for a transit project. That's way too long. Bond issues run out, costs escalate. There have been some experiences of up to 50% cost increases over the time of a transit project. That is just intolerable. We have to end this sequential process of endless reviews and turn that on its side and have these reviews done concurrently. With the transformation we spell out in this legislation and craft for the future of transportation, do those reviews concurrently. Be able to do transit projects, new starts, and extensions of existing operations in 3 years instead of 14 years. The system we have today is new starts, slow starts, and no starts. That is not serving the needs of transportation or reducing congestion in America's major metropolitan areas. We have to move much faster and put people to work and projects underway much faster. And we'll do that with this legislation. And ARTBA has made a great contribution to our process and to the legislative language. Mr. Ruane has been like a Marine Corps drill sergeant helping us get this done. So yes, I'm very keen to get this bill moving again. We reported this document from subcommittee in June of 2009. Unfortunately, the Senate thought they needed 18 months. The administration said they wanted 18 months. I said delay is the enemy of progress. It's way too long. We have to move fast. And in the stimulus, we've shown AASHTO, transit agencies, the contractor community, the associated general contractors, the road and transportation builders, and the building trades, and the truck drivers have all shown that given deadlines, they can perform, they can meet those deadlines, they can put projects to work, put people to work and projects underway in much shorter time frames than we've done in the past. So we're taking those lessons and incorporating them into the future of transportation. But we also need a follow-on to the stimulus. There are 30 states that have notified this committee that they will be unable to provide their full 20% match under the 80-20 federal aid highway program because their revenues are down, because their tax revenues are down, because their gas tax revenues are down, and those 30 states represent 70% of the population of the United States. The Associated General Contractors did a survey of their top 400 firms and came back to the committee with a report that when stimulus runs out, they expect to have 40 to 50% layoffs because the private sector financing for what the trade calls the vertical projects isn't coming back. Investors simply aren't making the investments that they were making. Knife River told me last year that in 2007 and 2008, nearly 80% of their work was in the private sector. Is that right, Ms. Fisk?
I believe it's close to that number, yeah.
And by last summer, because of the deterioration of the economy, the financial meltdown, most of those general contractors were doing 60+% of their work in the public sector. Well, we have to sustain the existing jobs and investments and carry that so that the rest of the economy can catch up and the private sector investments that had been made in the past can continue to be made in the future. We need to get through this summer. I think this is one more summer of stimulus will set the stage and move the country forward. But unfortunately, while we passed our legislation to fully fund the state 20% share of the federal highway program. In December, the Senate has not done that. They only passed the extension of current law through the end of this fiscal year and 3 additional months. That is not sufficient. That is not a good service to the country. Every witness that we've had for over these past 12 months of hearings has said we need an additional investment in transportation and other infrastructure projects to carry us through until the private sector has made its recovery, and then we'll see a return. Meanwhile, we've got permanent investments and improvements for the future of our transportation system and our wastewater treatment system. Now, Mr. Freeman, you and Terry Kuhlman have done outstanding work, as I said at the outset. You're 25-year professionals. You've been at this program for a long time. What lessons learned from the stimulus would you offer for the committee that we can apply to the future of the state revolving loan fund that's already passed the House, but again is awaiting action in the Senate?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for those kind words. The Clean Water State Revolving Funds, of course, are unique in that, first of all, these are cities that are building these projects, and we're providing the financing rather than doing direct contracting. The Clean Water Revolving Funds operate from a comprehensive priority list, so there's always projects in the pipeline that are in various stages of development. The fact that these are revolving loan funds rather than straight grants means there's an ongoing stream of repayments. The money is always revolving, so projects are continually moving through the processing, being funded, and the additional federal capital and state matching funds allows us to leverage those funds and generate additional lending capacity. But the key, I think, is that for the cities that are developing these projects and moving them through the process, they need steady and predictable funding. They need to know the money will be there when their projects are ready, and they need to have a clear sense of what the requirements will be. So we're very much in favor of the proposed reauthorization of the program. We were a little troubled with the 2010 appropriation because it imposed some additional requirements that were not predictable and became somewhat disruptive and difficult for the cities that were already in the pipeline, projects that were already bid and in some cases already under construction. So that's a difficult way to fund the process, and certainly a reauthorization bill that'll again restore kind of the predictability and the steady and funding for the program will be, we're very much in support of that and appreciate your efforts on that, and we'll do anything we can to help.
Excuse me. How were you able to manage the balance of loan funds with grant funds? Because the SRF is a loan program, and we provided a part of the funds as grant money and part as loan funds. And you were able to, not just you, but your agency was able to leverage those dollars to create more funding, including state funds from the appropriated by the Minnesota legislature. And you were able to leverage those into significantly greater investment than would otherwise have been the case. What did you do? You had some creative financing.
Mr. Chairman, Minnesota is one. I think there are approximately 35 or so states that operate their clean water revolving funds as leveraged programs, which, and in simple terms, what that means is we're using the the federal capitalization funds and the state match as kind of the seed money, and then selling, in the case of Minnesota, our AAA rated revenue bonds. They're not backed by the state, they're Minnesota Public Facilities Authority bonds that are backed by the repayment stream of all the loans that we've made previously. And so using that leveraging ability allows us to give a larger number of projects on the priority list, kind of give them the green light to move through the engineering design work, the approval process, and then we can have the money available when their projects are ready, rather than those projects waiting for us to tell them, okay, now you can start. They're always moving and always developing those projects, and we're able to use our leveraging to have the money available when they need it.
Do other states have a rating system such as the Minnesota Public Facilities Authority, where you, if I recall rightly, you rank the projects 1 through 263 on the wastewater treatment side and 1 through, 112 or 113 on the drinking water side? By need locally and by readiness to go to bid, as local financing capability in place. Are there other states that do have similar rating systems?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. All states have operate from that priority list. That's part of the requirement and the framework of both the clean water and drinking water state revolving funds. In our case, and actually those numbers have increased quite a bit since I think the last time we provided you a list. We now have over 280 projects on the clean water list for about $2.1 billion. The drinking water list, I think, has close to 300 projects as well. So the needs are certainly there. We rank those projects. Actually, we don't. Our partners with the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency ranks those clean water projects based on environmental and public health factors, and so that's the ranking that we follow. And then we work with communities to identify the ones that have completed the preliminary planning work and will be ready to go to construction. And that's the list that we take then and develop the intended use plan from. So all of those cities know if they get to reach a certain point where the planning is done, they can then move on, and we will put them in a fundable range on our intended use plan and have the money available when their projects are ready.
Very good. In our reauthorization of the State Revolving Loan Fund program, we require states to develop management plans, ranking of projects, and develop a long-range program of investment, and using the criteria that you just cited. We hope that the Senate will act on that legislation. It's a $15 billion authorization over the next 5 years. I think it's far less than what the nation needs, but it's responsible funding, and we know that it will be fully offset. Ms. Richardson, in the surface transportation program, we had a requirement for a two-part requirement for projects to get underway in 90 days and others in 120 days. And initially, state DOTs said, oh, that will be too difficult for us to meet. But in the end, all state DOTs have far exceeded their original. They underestimated their own ability to perform. Now, what lessons are there to be drawn for the future of transportation from your stimulus experience?
Well, a couple come to mind based on your comments. One, I think that we cannot underestimate how much work there is that needs to be done in the transportation infrastructure in this country. So when we go to states and other jurisdictions and say, what projects do you have, there's a considerable backlog and a lot of needs out there. So I think that there will always be a pool of very good projects for us to choose from, whether it's for our regular funding or for any special funding. The second lesson is the one that you highlight, and that is maybe we underestimated our own abilities a little bit, but you're always concerned when you hear time frames like that because we're used to longer time frames. But I think when asked to change our paradigm and look at things a little differently, we all were able to come through and deliver in that type of time frame. The 120 days to obligation, everybody met. I know as there were discussions about a follow-along stimulus in the jobs bill, there was concern that that had language in it that said 90 days to contract. But in fact, when we did the survey of states to find out what other ready-to-go projects were out there and identified over 9,800 projects at $80 billion, I'm told that somewhere around half of those could actually get to contract within 90 days. So I think we've learned that we can, with the kind of work, that the pent-up demand that's out there, the kind of work that needs to be done just to preserve this system from crumbling, that there is certainly enough work out there that we could do it quickly, whether it's 120 days to obligation or 90 days to contract.
Well, those are important lessons learned, and the program of project expediting, or the Office of Project Expediting, that we will include in this bill that's been already reported from subcommittee, will take those lessons learned and apply them and expedite the process, right, so that we're not doing multiple reviews in sequence that delay project delivery. Those is not to set aside any environmental concern or other permitting requirements of a host of government agencies, townships and sewer boards and the Environmental Protection Agency and all and the National Trust for Historic Preservation all have a permit responsibility, but they can be done concurrently rather than sequentially.
Absolutely. In fact, when we looked at that in our state in the past decade, we had we termed it the can-do process. Can-do. It was to do exactly that, see where in our process we could have things running in parallel rather than sequentially, so that we would take considerable chunks of time out of that lengthy process.
Well, that's where we want to go for the future. Now, what is the situation in Iowa? I mentioned 30 states have notified the committee. Iowa was one of those. What are your highway funding prospects looking better or the same as earlier this year?
I think that, like all states, the economy, of course, is affecting our revenue streams, and both in terms our revenue at the state level comes from fuel taxes and then also fees on new vehicles purchased, on the registration fees and some fees at the time of purchase. When the economy is not as strong, people aren't buying as many vehicles, nor driving them as much. So we certainly have a lag in our revenues from what we were projecting. But I believe that our legislature at the state level 2 years ago took on the hard task of looking for additional state revenue and passed a piece of legislation called Time 21 that is bringing more revenue at the state level into the transportation fund, the road use tax fund. It's just that that's ramping up over about 7 or 8 years. So our legislature has put in place something that will bring some additional state funds in gradually over the next few years, and I think that will help us continue to have enough match for federal funds. But it's touch and go, and there are other states where it certainly is already a problem.
That's why we need to get this bill passed.
I agree.
And a long-term funding mechanism.
Yes.
Could
not agree more.
And an additional
revenue,
maybe 6-month stimulus, but also significantly more revenue. In this legislation, we expressly prohibited project specific designations known as high priority projects. Each state has a ranking process that they've followed. So you made selections of projects based on readiness, that is, meeting the criteria of the Act, which is through right-of-way acquisition, environmental impact statement completed, design and engineering down to final design, ready to go to bid, provided the money was available. Is that essentially the process that Iowa used and other states have used?
Yes, and of course there were other criteria that we paid attention to. For example, economically distressed areas, and making sure we identified those and tried to overlay that on our selection process, as well as making sure that we had a good blend of projects geographically, urban and rural. And I think all states paid attention to those things. They were in the bill. We're very fortunate in Iowa that the process we traditionally use, that we were able to use for the Recovery Act, is one that's very collaborative with our local partners, the metropolitan planning organizations and the regional planning agencies. We already work in concert with them, and they help identify projects. We try to have a little bit more local input into helping to define some of the projects. That process serves us very well, and it was what I thought helped Iowa really jump the gun and get going very quickly, because we had already talked with those local partners. They had helped identify priority projects. We had all of ours at the state level, and that meant that we had that priority list of projects ready to go when you passed the bill. And we would be in the same situation before. We've already done that in case there's another stimulus. We've all made sure we've got that priority list all ready to go.
Well, that's wonderful. That's very encouraging. Every state DOT director I've talked to, and I've had a conversation, at least half, maybe more than half, 30 of them, are in the same situation. Mr. Miller, what is the average age of, prior to the stimulus funding, what was the average age of your fleet?
Chairman Oberstar, we, like all of the systems Iowa, had a very old fleet. I think the average was somewhere around 9 years, with the typical bus lasting 12. And we are just very thankful for the stimulus dollars, because those, combined with the annual appropriation, our regular federal dollars, we were able to buy, in this one order that's arriving this month, a sixth of our fleet, or replace about 80% of our buses that were over their useful life. It's been fantastic.
Will that also provide, those new buses provide more passenger capacity?
Not necessarily more passenger capacity, but they break down on the side of the highway, and which affects our passengers.
Greater reliability.
Certainly 1/5 as often, or they cost half as much to maintain as those older buses. So, yeah, they're a real boon to our system.
So just as in the highway side, we're replacing pavement, making a better ride and drive for people. On the transit side, better equipment, lower cost to operate, and longer service life for the equipment.
Not to mention the environmental benefits, the cleaner engines, and and we even have a hybrid bus, so the newer buses are beneficial in that area too.
Terrific, thank you, Mr. Wright. Does the future of funding give you concern? That is what I cited a moment ago about the general contractors being concerned that the private sector investments aren't recovering as all would have liked, and the funding continuing and perhaps even winding down from some of the stimulus by the middle of summer. What's the outlook from the contractor side, from the ARTBA side?
It's exactly like what you described earlier. My company's balance of private versus public work is gone from 50-50 to probably 80-20 now. 80% being public work. The short term with the federal transportation bill not being being extended and extended and extended, it gives us no faith or no belief that the workload is there. So we haven't bought any equipment in the last couple of years. our capital investment is just down dramatically. It's gone from the ability to plan your work, looking ahead, to just reactionary to what is absolutely required. When you have a 6-month extension, it's hard to go make a 6-year investment.
And that has Caterpillar worried, and it has the other equipment manufacturers concerned, and a matter of concern and astonishment to me that this time last year, the United States had developed a new export product, used construction equipment. We were filling up containers, shipping backhoes and D4 and D8 cats and front-end loaders to China and India, where they were making investments in their stimulus programs. China committed 9% of its gross domestic product to stimulus, a $540 billion, limited to highway, port, airport, rail, and wastewater treatment projects. They're on track to complete an 820-mile rail line from Beijing to Shanghai, which is the distance Boston to Richmond on the east coast of the United States, 822 miles. You'll be able to travel that distance in 4 hours with 220-mile-an-hour steel-on-steel passenger rail. They've made the investment in it. And this time next year, there'll be full ridership. That's between two megalopolises of 12 million people in Beijing and 16 million in Shanghai. The European community has committed $1.4 trillion over a 20-year period to upgrade its aviation, water, passenger rail, and highway infrastructure, including building a canal to link the North Sea to the Black Sea. That's 2,000 miles across the heart of Europe, to move goods more efficiently, more effectively, with less environmental impact, and at lower cost to shippers and consumers. We're just falling behind. Their plan includes additional 7,200 miles of high-speed passenger rail line in Europe. President Obama put $8 billion for passenger rail in this country, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the European community is doing, in addition to their already extensive and successful program. So here we come back to the point. Other countries have made these investments. They're stimulating their economies. They're having great short-term as well as long-term investment impacts. Now, you mentioned your concern about buying equipment. What amortization period do you have to look at as a contractor for these pieces of equipment that I mentioned they're not inexpensive? You don't just buy it on your credit card. You've got to figure out how you're going to pay for that long term, right?
You do not put $1 million crane on your credit card. We amortize most of our stuff on about 60 months. So it's approximately the life of a highway bill.
Very interesting. So you really want to see a longer term investment and greater stability and continuity of funding.
Absolutely, sir. We have just this week there was a conversation in my office about should we buy 2 machines or should we rent them? Well, we only have 90 days worth of work for them. It's hard to make a 5-year commitment to that process when you cannot see any further than that. If with the appropriate bill in place, you would at least believe you have the opportunity to compete for a market that you know is there, and would give you the faith to go ahead and pull the trigger, for lack of a better way of saying it.
And what we've seen also in this stimulus period is that bids have been coming in 25% below original design estimates because there's so much competition in the marketplace, and materials costs even have dropped. in the U.S. During this recession period. Was that your experience as well?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, it is. There seems to be 3 to 4 times as many bidders on projects as people move from the public sector, from the private sector back to the public sector in their bidding process, and margins are very, very low.
Now, Ms. Veronique de Rugy, c'est bien français ça, oui? Vous êtes française d'origine?
Oui, je suis française.
Formidable. D'où ça en France?
Paris, je suis née à Paris, mais mes parents sont en Normandie.
De Normandie. Ah,
Votre accent est remarquable.
Et la belle Normandie, les huîtres de Normandie sont les plus délicieuses au monde. Merci. Et félicitations sur votre anglais.
Merci.
Vous êtes longtemps aux États-Unis?
10 ans.
10 ans, alors. Oh, que j'aurais pu faire 10 ans à Paris. Well, thank you very much for it.
I'm not sure my mom is as happy about this, but
we'll translate this later for the reporters. President Sarkozy will be in the United States shortly. He too had a plan de relance of 47 milliards d'euros, 47 billion euros, which is roughly $60 billion. And their recovery plan has created jobs, has stimulated the economy, has moved France ahead. But you make a good deal of reference in your testimony about party affiliation and political variables, but you must be talking about something other than the programs of our committee.
The way I looked at the numbers, I only used the data from recovery.org, and I compared them to other publicly available data, government data, and then I ran regressions, and the spending that I'm talking about covers, some of the transportation money. So $10 billion exactly of that data that I looked at was spent through the Department of Transportation.
But these correlations of party affiliation and political variables and so on would surely have to be happenstance rather than deliberate.
Well, the only thing I can tell you for sure is that when you look at the regressions, we can tell that whether the district is represented by a Democrat or a Republican matters for the funding. What I cannot tell you is how much this factor has influenced the decision compared to other factors such as the formula or the unemployment in the states, even though my findings also find that the money does not seem to be guided by the level of unemployment
in our legislation, we specifically directed, as Ms. Richardson said, that priority be given to areas of highest unemployment as measured by the Economic Development Administration of the U.S. Department of Commerce, which has a map of the United States by county in which EDA certifies the unemployment level for each county and updates it monthly. And we wanted those dollars to go to the areas of highest unemployment, the areas of greatest economic distress. And secondly, we wanted an equitable distribution of dollars so that not all the money would be used up in the major metropolitan areas, such as Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Chicago in Illinois, or Los Angeles in California. They could consume the state's entire stimulus allocation in one major metropolitan area. That would not be right. And state departments of transportation are the ones who have made those allocations, and they've distributed the funds. And as Richardson's son, they spent a good deal of time assuring that projects went to the areas of highest unemployment. So I'd be very interested to see your the backup detail
Absolutely.
for your analysis.
All the data is available for download at the Mercatus.org exactly for that reason, because we wanted to be absolutely transparent about, so we've put not only the data, the raw data, but also the regression that we've used and the result of the analysis. What I can tell you is the data that we've used for unemployment, so we've used two sorts of data. The first report that we did was for the first quarter of the money allocated. We used unemployment level in the districts, and we found that there was no correlation. The second time around, actually informed by, after talking with a series of economists who just do econometrics all the time, they suggested that a better measure and a better way to assess unemployment level is to actually look at the variation of unemployment between time to actually get not only a sense of the unemployment level in absolute term, but also how hit and hurt each given district was by the recession. And again, we were using Bureau of Labor Statistics and Census Bureau data. I mean, these are totally official data. And we, again, no matter what type of unemployment indicator we find absolutely no correlation. In fact, if I remember correctly, the coefficient that we use make it almost look as if it was done intentionally to not, even though I know it's not the case. But it was quite stunning because I assumed, considering the rationale behind the stimulus bill, that we would find a strong correlation. And we tested it many different ways. We use different methods, and you can, actually I would be happy, you don't even have to go to our website, I would be happy to even send it to you.
That would be very helpful. But you say you did this on the basis of congressional districts?
Congressional districts, yeah.
My congressional district, for example, is the size of the eastern seaboard from here to Connecticut.
So we controlled for the size. We controlled for, that's what regression analysis do, is to control for the size.
And my district has the highest unemployment of the whole state.
But that's, these regression, this is why we do regression analysis rather than just comparing, numbers, is because it controls for all the variation that it could be.
And the funding in Minnesota is controlled by the Department of Transportation under a Republican governor, who, if he were attempting to manipulate, would have avoided my district. But that's clearly not the case. He did not put his hand into it. He did not involve himself. I don't know of any other states where governors have attempted to. There's no evidence on the record that there's been any manipulation.
I am absolutely not judging intent. I'm just looking at facts. In fact, this report was done, and it's called Stimulus Fact, to provide facts about the stimulus to you, members of Congress, so you could actually decide what's happening.
We would be concerned if there were any manipulation at the state level of these funds.
My data doesn't look at intent. The only thing it looks at is results. And again, this data is based on the data we found, reported by recipients of the awards, and as posted on recovery.gov.
Well, thank you. It's a very interesting correlation, and I would like to receive the entire body of
absolutely.
Data.
I would be happy.
And I will review it myself. Merci infiniment.
Merci beaucoup, Mr. Chairman. I don't know how to say this.
Comme l'a dit Baudelaire, l'albatros, souvent pour s'amuser, les hommes d'équipage prennent les albatros, vastes oiseaux des mers qui suivent, indolents compagnons de voyage, le navire glissant sur les gouffres amers.
Merveilleux.
J'aime Baudelaire.
Moi aussi.
J'aime la France, la culture française et la belle langue de Molière.
Votre français est remarquable.
Merci, j'apprécie fortement. All right, after that love affair in French. For the future of transportation funding, which has been the big obstacle in getting this bill moving, from time immemorial, that is from 1956 forward, we have had the Federal Highway Trust Fund. In 1956, the Congress enacted a 3-cent user fee. President Eisenhower signed the bill into law. 3 cents in 1956 represented 10% of the cost of fuel, which was 30 cents a gallon. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan signed a 5-cent increase in the user fee. At the time, he said this 5 cents is budget neutral. The users of the system are paying for their use of that system. And this 5 cents represents the equivalent of 2 shock absorbers in a year on your car. Fast forward to 2009, and we have the President of the United States who says, I made a commitment and the campaign wouldn't raise your taxes. We have senators who say we can't raise taxes in time of a recession. But in 1958, the Bureau of Public Roads came back to the Congress and said that 3 cents isn't sufficient. We need another penny increase in the user fee. Congress passed it. This House passed it on a voice vote. You can't pass the prayer on a voice vote today. We need to revive that spirit of investment in America's future. Just as I cited a little bit ago that the European community has committed $1.4 trillion for their future to remain competitive in the world marketplace, as China is doing now, as Japan has done, as India is doing with their Golden Triangle $25 billion highway program. And we have to move our goods more efficiently in this marketplace. Look, UPS did a survey of their operations nationwide. For every 5 minutes delay their trucks experience, they lose $100 million in overtime charges for costs for their truck drivers and late delivery fees for their customers. In the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, an independent group did a survey of the cost of congestion. Among the company studies was General Mills. For every they spend $692 million a year moving their Wheaties and Betty Crocker goods to market. But for every mile an hour their trucks travel below the speed limit, it costs them $2 million in overtime charges to their drivers and late delivery fees for their customers. There is a business cost to delay. Just try anywhere in America to get a plumber. We'll be there between 8 and noon. Plumbing contractors told us that they used to make 8 or 9 calls a day, now they're doing 4. That means their business is less efficient because they can't get through the congestion. So we have to make these changes. We have to deliver projects more expeditiously. We have to put people to work faster. We have to get goods moving more efficiently. We do this with freight movement corridors and a whole host of investments for major metropolitan areas of the country. But we have to finance. We have to have a $450 billion investment in America's future of transportation, recommended by 2 independent national commissions. So what I'm proposing, or proposing for consideration, is an idea that I will attribute to Mr. Basso of Ashto, who many years ago worked on this idea for Ashto, and at the time I said, Jack, that won't work. Well, I've come back to him and said, Jack, it has to work. It's a modification of a bonding proposal. We would direct we, the Congress, would direct the Treasury to deposit $130 billion in bonds, Treasury bonds, into the Highway Trust Fund to be repaid with revenues from the Highway Trust Fund out into the future. And we would delay the repayment for the first perhaps 4 years, giving the economy time to recover, at which time we would need to increase the highway user fee, probably by 2014, 2015, and begin repaying the Treasury bonds, capital, and interest at the Treasury rate of interest. That would give us, based with the baseline of the current revenues into the trust fund, the $450 billion over 6 years. Mr. Wright, what do you think about that?
I think it's a wonderful idea. Let's get started.
I'm hitting you cold. You haven't had time to see this or think it, but from your perspective, a contractor, business operator, what do you think? You think it's a good workable idea?
It sounds workable to me, sir. Yes. I would order some equipment.
Thank you. Mr. Wharton, what do you think here on the firing line?
Chairman Oberstar, I think that it is definitely needed. As I mentioned in my testimony, we see a cliff, and unless there is a long-term solution, there's going to be a lot more people looking for work and a lot of businesses closing down. So we need to act, and we need to act now.
Ms. Richardson, you're a practitioner at the state level. What do you think? Is this workable? Well, can you work within that framework?
Well, Chairman Oberstar, if you and Jack Basso say it's workable, I would hate to argue with either of you, the two of you together. It certainly sounds interesting. I've not heard that discussed and haven't thought a lot about it. The idea of waiting 3 or 4 years for the economy to recover would be an appealing part of it, would allow to appeal to some of the dissenters in terms of increasing funding. I guess one of the other questions would be, is 15 or 20 cents going to be enough? But you guys have done the math. So I think it's very intriguing, very intriguing.
Well, this is the first time it's been discussed in an open forum. Yeah. I've tried it out on small groups here and there, and bouncing off and economists. And Ms. Fisk, Mr. Luna, what do you think about the future of transportation?
Mr. Oberstar, Chairman, I believe that transportation is the backbone of the United States. The Eisenhower system set forth back then really put the plantation down for us, and I think we need to move forward, and I think your bill or proposal there is actually could very well work, and I support it, and thank you.
Thank you. And Florentino, mi amigo, no habla español como francés, but go ahead, please. Oh, you have to push the button on the microphone there.
Well,
do you think we need to make this kind of investment in the future of transportation?
Yeah, it to be necessary for everybody, to have investment for.
And if you had to spend another 10 or 15 cents on gasoline every time you filled up, knowing that it makes it possible to make the investment in a transportation system that will create employment opportunities, you think it's worth it?
Yes, we have to.
Thank you. Jeff Freeman, we don't fund the the wastewater treatment system like we do surface transportation. So, but just as a consumer of the system, what do you think?
Mr. Chairman, I think it sounds like a very innovative idea, and actually that's tying it back to what I know more about with the Clean Water Revolving Fund and wastewater financing, that was really the key to the success of the program. Is it's an innovative and sort of a different approach to how financing is being done for municipal wastewater treatment, setting up these revolving funds and using then the ability to leverage money. In that way, I think your proposal is similar, and I'm all for it.
Thank you. Madame Rugy, you're an economist, I take it.
Yeah. Yes.
What do you think?
I think that the government doesn't have any money, and as you've mentioned, each time the government spends money, it needs to take it somewhere in the economy, and it makes it very hard to actually measure the return, the true return on investment on the dollars invested by the government. 15 cents, might not seem like a lot to you, to me. This 15 cents is on top of the dramatic increase in gasoline prices that we've seen certainly in the last 10 years. So sure, it's a marginal increase, but more importantly, I really think that measuring the return on investment that we make just let me give you an example. Measuring the performance of government action by how much it spends seems to me like the wrong measure of things. Like, I can go to the grocery store and spend $100. What matters is not so much that I've spent $100, but it is what I've bought with it, right? Whether with this I've been able to actually buy enough money to feed my family, and not just with junk, but with things that actually are good for them. And I feel very often in all the conversation that go on is that, unfortunately, the performance of the government is measured more by how much it's spent than compared to how much it produces. Even when we talk about how many jobs were created, not to mention that it's extremely hard to actually measure, as I've said in my oral testimony, but very often these measures are very arbitrary, and they don't really quite look at how much economic growth has been produced. Rather, so for instance, you can spend government dollars to create a job to dig a hole and create another job to fill this hole. Is this created economic growth? Maybe, maybe not. And I think it would be, you've talked a lot about accountability. It would be very, very, very important to actually think very, very hard about how we can better measure the return on government dollars, our dollars, because again, for the government to be able to spend money, it needs to either tax it, borrow it, or print it. And all of these things have consequences for us who live in America.
In the surface transportation program, however, as in our aviation program, we have an aviation trust fund, we have the highway trust fund. The revenues collected at the gas pump do not go into the general treasury of the federal government. They're deposited into the highway trust fund, and the U.S. Treasury pays interest on those revenues deposited in the trust fund, and they are allocated and reserved only for highway and transit funding according to the formulas set forth by the Congress. In 1956, our gross domestic product was $345 billion. Today it's $13 trillion. In 1956, there was one car per household. That car drove, on average, 6,000 miles a year. Today we have, on average, 3 cars per household. They're driving 15,000 miles each. We had 1 million trucks in America in 1956. We have over 7 million trucks on our highways today. Our economy depends on mobility, on movement of people and goods. The interstate highway system and the national highway system that in which the interstate is now included have been the fundamental reasons for which our economy has expanded at the rate that it has grown. and we can track these figures with the annual reports of the Texas Transportation Institute that measures the cost of congestion. In the 75 major metropolitan areas of this country, congestion last year cost those metropolitan areas $86 billion. People are spending a week longer in their cars than they would if they could drive at posted highway speeds. They're buying 4 and 5 tanks of gasoline more than they would if they could drive at posted highway speeds. They're also experiencing higher maintenance costs on their vehicles because the road surface is in such poor condition that they're buying more shock absorbers and more tires and more other equipment for their vehicles. Where we improve the roadway, where we make it more efficient and safer and save lives, we're improving our economy. The Highway Trust Fund is different from other government investments. That's what I'm saying. And so with the aviation program.
Can I
Yes.
add something? I'm not a transportation expert, but I've read a lot of reports about transportation funding. And I remember in particular a pretty groundbreaking report produced by the Urban Institute in 2004, I believe, where they actually looked at the economic literature on transportation spending and acknowledged that for very, very long, in fact, economists agreed that investment in transportation was essential to economic growth for exactly the reason that you've talked about, and that it had become not clear at all anymore. We seem to have hit a threshold. However, maybe there are other ways to do everything you want to do, such as actually making consumer pay more of the cost of the road they're using. For instance, I will give you an example in France. The A14 highway, which is a privately owned highway in Paris that goes out to the west, to Rouen, Caen, and all this, it's privately funded and it has a fee. And it actually makes a profit and it's actually allowed massive decongestion of the Parisian highway system, in particular on Fridays and weekends, Sunday, when people want to come in and out of the city. So maybe there is something to be said to actually look at France for this. And this is not a government solution. Obviously, it was facilitated by the government that allowed, but it's privately owned and it's actually working. Obviously, a choice is given to people to pay that fee, which is pretty expensive. But what it does, it actually allows to reduce the congestion on other roads. And that's where my expertise ends.
Same with the bridge in the south of France to Spain.
Yeah.
The massive, I've seen the video of the building of that beautiful structure, massive structure, but that was funded by tolls.
So maybe it is time to look outside of the way.
In fact, we do that in this bill. We provide in our program for metropolitan mobility and access an array of funds for those 75 major metropolitan areas of the country who have the worst congestion, to use tax credit bonds, tax-exempt bonds, public-private partnerships, design, build authority, congestion pricing, tolling, but only for new capacity, not tolling existing roadways that have already been paid for by the users, and provide those metropolitan areas new financial tolling, new financial capabilities, and as I said, include tolling, as you've suggested, because those are unique situations. But we're not going to allow tolling of the interstate highway system. It's already been built and paid for.
I was talking about something else.
Yeah.
Another thing that
But new capacity, that is also a need that we have.
But it is also possible that if there is a profit to be made, and I believe that in cities that are very highly congested, there is a gigantic profit to be made by private developer. that they would make it independent of government funds or incentives, and that would save taxpayers money.
The California legislature approved a toll authority for a private contractor under a bidding process to build, as they proposed, 2 lanes of highway, California 90. The tolling, the company won the bid. They built 20 miles of this roadway and set the tolls, but few people used it. The tolling company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The state, however, was experiencing increasing congestion on the adjoining state highways with rising fatalities and injuries. So the state proposed to build 2 additional lanes of freeway in that corridor. The tolling authority sued the state because they had provision in the state legislative authorizing bill for exclusivity in the corridor. No competition from any other source. The state of California wound up acquiring the tolling authority and building 2 additional lane miles of roadway and retired the tolls and continued the roadway. So not in all situations does tolling succeed.
Well,
but there is an appropriate place for it in the future transportation, and we provide for it in this legislation.
Maybe the fact that there was this private company was guaranteed no competition had to do led to actually this company not to do the best job it could.
No, the tolls were too high. That was the conclusion. Mr. Miller, for the future of transportation, we provided funding in this bill. Mr. Cummings asked you the question, what happens when the authority to use capital account monies for operating expense? In our legislation, we provide authority for up to 10% of your capital account for smaller systems to use in their operating account and only 5% for the larger systems. There's considerable tension within the transit community over that provision. What thoughts do you have? Not necessarily a percentage, but what is the balance? What is the proper balance here between operating account and capital account?
Well, Mr. Oberstar, it's certainly a challenging question for transit because, as you know, most of the smaller systems who have the ability to use all of their federal funds for operations, at least most of the smaller systems in Iowa under 200,000 do use all of their money for to offset local funding. Des Moines is in an area over 200,000, so we cannot use our regular funds for operations, only capital, and we are saving jobs with the great ability to use 10% of our stimulus dollars. Moving forward, certainly, again, like some of the other folks have testified, there is a cliff. These are one-time funding, and we're not sure exactly how we're going to be able to handle it moving forward. We would certainly be supportive of a limited ability to use some of our federal funds for operations in another stimulus bill, should that become available, or longer term?
Well, this is part of the tension within our surface transportation program. And at the beginning of the first 15 years of the interstate highway program, the federal funds were provided for capital account for construction. Only in the only in the mid-'70s did interstate maintenance become a category of funding. The principle was the federal government, with the Highway Trust Fund, would provide 90% of the cost of building this new system of roadways, divided, access-controlled superhighways. And the states would then maintain it. But as the interstate aged And it's 1% of the highway mileage of the entire United States. It carries 26% of the traffic, of the vehicle miles traveled, go on our interstate. It began to wear down, and reluctantly the Congress provided a limited amount of funding for interstate maintenance. That eventually grew to a larger number as on average 15% of the interstate needs to be rebuilt almost every year in order to keep pace with the growing demands on the system and the deterioration of the bridges. Half of the bridges of this country were built in the 1960s with interstate highway funds. So similarly with the transit, the original concept was the federal partnership with transit agencies would be to provide the capital to acquire the equipment, and the local entity would maintain it. And generally that was a 50-50 proposition. In some cases it's a little bit higher. We're moving into we're now firmly in the post-interstate era of transportation. We are in an intermodal era, long overdue, but now thinking intermodally. And so it is appropriate, I think, to provide some level of federal funding for transit operations. But we're still, it's still an open question of just how much that should be. We've set some goals in this legislation, but that will be a continuing dialogue. So I urge you and APTA to think more about that subject matter and help us move forward.
Yes, as I mentioned in my testimony, when I was out at public meetings these last few months talking about our service reductions we were going to have to make because of the drop in the economy, it was a very tough question to answer. Why are you buying buses and spending all this capital money, and why can't you save my route? And it is a tough question to answer to anybody, to explain that's how we have to do it. So, yes, as we're moving forward, I think there needs to be a balance.
Exactly. In the stimulus, we thought long and hard about this issue. And Bev Scott, the director of the Atlanta system, said, it doesn't make sense on the one hand for you to provide us funds to buy new buses, and for us, on the other hand, to lay off drivers of existing buses in our system. So give us some flexibility to keep the existing system operating as well as replace our fleet and make it more efficient and reduce our cost of operation.
Right.
Well, all of you have been very thoughtful and very contributory in your responses, and you've helped shape a view of the stimulus up to this point. My judgment is it's doing what we intended. 1,200,000 jobs created, and more to come. 35,000 lane miles of highway improved, 1,200 bridges restored, replaced, rebuilt. Over 10,000 transit vehicles acquired. That has created jobs in the production sector, building those buses, building those rail cars, and we're seeing the effects all reverberate throughout our economy. We need to sustain it. We need to continue it. And I thank all of you who've made your contributions. Madame Rugy, pour votre observation, qui sont très particulières, and everyone else, you only get it in English. Thank you very much for your testimony, and keep up your great work, each in your respective ways. And for those who are on the front lines, Ms. Fisk, Mr. Luna, keep driving, keep building. Committee is adjourned.